On June 10, 1991, 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard was abducted outside of her home in South Lake Tahoe, California. Despite several witnesses, including her own stepfather, authorities had no leads as to who had taken her. The FBI brought them no closer to finding Jaycee. For nearly 2 decades, it seemed as if she would never be found. On August 24, 2009, just over 18 years later, a man named Philip Garrido visited the University of California, Berkeley campus with his 2 daughters to inquire about hosting a religious event at the school. However, it turned out that the police department had conducted a background check on him. They discovered that he was a registered sex offender on parole for kidnapping and rape. On top of this, his parole officer was unaware he had children. 2 days later, he showed up for a parole meeting, bringing his wife Nancy, the 2 young girls, and a 3rd young woman, and eventually he gave up the act and confessed everything. The 2 youngest girls were his children, but not with his wife Nancy. They were actually the daughters of the eldest girl, who went by the name Alyssa. Philip had kidnapped her 18 years earlier and raped her repeatedly. Her real name was Jaycee Dugard. 18 years of captivity, she was free, and she would go on to tell her story. Before her kidnapping, Jaycee Lee Dugard was a normal girl. She was born on May 3, 1980, and lived with her mother, Terry, and her stepfather, Carl Provin. Carl and Terry had another daughter, Shayna, in 1990. The year after her little sister was born, Jaycee's life would take a turn. Philip Garrido was born on April 5, 1951, in Pittsburgh. His father said he was a good boy, but this changed after a serious motorcycle accident as a teenager. He turned to using drugs, and later in court he would admit to masturbating in his car by the side of elementary and high schools while watching girls. Philip had a history of sexual violence. According to the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office, he'd already been convicted of several crimes by the time he had abducted Jaycee. In 1972, he drugged and raped a 14-year-old girl in Contra Costa County. The case didn't go to court because she declined to testify. The following year, he got married to his high school classmate, Christine Murphy, who accused him of domestic violence and alleged that he had kidnapped her when she tried to leave him. 4 years later, in June, in South Lake Tahoe, he convinced a 19-year-old to get into his car, then handcuffed and raped her. Later that year, in November 1976, he attempted to do the same thing to a 25-year-old woman, but she managed to escape him and alert neighbours. 1 hour later, he decided to lure another victim to his car. At this time, he was 25 years old, and he managed to lure Catherine Calloway to a warehouse in Reno, Nevada, where he raped her for 5.5 hours. When a police officer noticed a car parked outside the warehouse and then a broken lock on its door, he knocked on the door and was greeted by Philip. Catherine then emerged and asked for help. He was arrested. He was then given a psych evaluation that diagnosed him as a sexual deviant, a chronic drug abuser, depression, and anxiety. He was also diagnosed with personality disorder. This crime alone earned him a prison sentence of 50 years. However, he would be certified as not contributing to menace to health, safety, and morals of society. But months later, after his release, he visited one of his victims, who was working in South Lake Tahoe. He told her, "It's been 11 years since I had a drink." The victim reported this to his parole officer, and they brushed it off, noting it in his file that to subject to electronic monitoring would be too much of a hassle based on the hysteria or concerns of the victim. Extremely little regard had been paid to this incident, so he moved on to his next victim, and then he found her on June 10, 1991. At Leavenworth, he met Nancy, who was visiting her uncle, another prisoner. On October 5, 1981, he and Nancy were married at prison. On January 22, 1988, he was released from Leavenworth to Nevada State Prison, where he served 7 months of a 5-year sentence to life. He was transferred to federal parole authorities in Contra Costa County on August 26, 1988. He and Nancy moved to the city of Anatok and lived in the home of his elderly mother, who suffered from dementia. As a parolee, he wore an ankle bracelet and was regularly visited by parole officers, local sheriff's deputies, and federal agents. On June 10, 1991, Terry worked as a typesetter at a print house. She left for work early in the day. Jaycee, who was 11, wore her favourite all-pink outfit as she walked up to the hill from her house to catch the school bus. When she was halfway up the hill, a grey car approached her. She thought that the man driving the car was stopping to ask for directions. The driver, who was Philip, rolled down the window and tased Jaycee with a stun gun before abducting her. His wife, Nancy, dragged her into the car and removed her clothing, leaving only a butterfly-shaped ring that Jaycee would hide from them for the next 18 years. Nancy covered her with a blanket and held her down as she drifted in and out of consciousness during the 3-hour drive to the Garridos, 120 miles away in Antioch. The only time Jaycee spoke was when she pleaded that her parents could not afford a ransom. The district attorney in the case believed that Nancy had scouted Jaycee as a prize for Philip. Carl, her stepfather, witnessed the abduction from within sight of their home. He saw 2 people in a mid-sized grey car, possibly a Mercury Monarch, making a U-turn at the school bus stop where Jaycee was waiting, and a woman forced Jaycee into the car. He chased after them on a bike, but was unable to overtake the vehicle. Some of her classmates were also witnesses to the abduction. Carl and Terry split a few years after Jaycee's disappearance, with Carl explaining that the stress of the kidnapping was what caused their marriage to unravel. Even years after she was found, he struggled to come to terms with what had happened that day. He said, "Looking back, maybe I regret I did not give her more hugs. Terry's family thought I was mean to her. I think they thought I was the reason she did not run away from the Garridos. But I can tell you now I really cared for that girl." As authorities continued their searches, Jaycee was being forced into her new life 120 miles away in Antioch, California, in a shack in the backyard of Philip and Nancy's home. Upon her captivity, she was handcuffed and left naked in the shed, which was bolted shut. Right after, he forced her into the shower with him, which was the first time she was exposed to an unclothed man. During her first week in captivity, she remained in handcuffs, her only human contact being Philip, who sometimes brought her fast food and talked to her. He provided her a bucket for her to use to relieve herself. A week after the kidnapping, he raped her while handcuffed for the first time. He continued to do this frequently, doing it at least once a week for the first 3 years of her captivity. At one point, he provided her with a television, but she could not watch the news and remained unaware of the search for her. Almost a month and a half into her kidnapping, he moved her into a larger room next door, where she was handcuffed to a bed. He explained that the demon angels let him take her and that she would help him with his sexual problems because society had ignored him. He would occasionally go on long drug binges, during which he would force her to keep him company by performing sexual favours and engaging in various other activities with him. He made her listen out for the voices he said he could hear from the walls, and often professed a belief that he was a chosen servant of God. These binges would end up with him sobbing and apologising to her, alternating with threats to sell her to people who would put her in a cage. 7 months into her captivity, he introduced Jaycee to his wife, who brought the child a stuffed animal and chocolate milk, and engaged in the same tearful apologies. Though Jaycee craved the woman's approval at the time, in 2011 ABC News interview she stated that Nancy was just as manipulative as him. Almost 3 years into her captivity, they began to allow her to have some freedom from her handcuffs for periods of time, but the door was still bolted. On Easter Sunday of '94, they gave her cooked food for the first time. They told her they believed she was pregnant, and she was only 13 years old. She gave birth when she was 14 on August 18, 1994. The last time Philip raped her was the time she gave birth to her second daughter when she was 17 on November 13, 1997. In both instances, she gave birth to her daughter, and the Garridos delivered the children without any medical assistance. Soon her daughters were living with her in her backyard prison. Jaycee kept a journal during her 18 years hidden away in the backyard. She wrote about being afraid, lonely, depressed, and feeling unloved. Initially, she wrote about her family and wondered whether they were looking for her. In time, however, her isolation and depression led her to crave any type of human interaction, even if it came from them. When she was eventually found alive after 18 years, she went through a long adjustment period, unfamiliar with what it was like to be loved or treated as a human being. When she published her memoir, A Stolen Life, in July 2011, she was also understandably critical of the parole agents who for nearly 2 decades never caught on to his deception. In August 2009, 2 UC Berkeley police officers were suspicious of Philip and helped to finally solve the mystery of Jaycee's disappearance. But how had his parole officer not found her in his backyard? The law enforcement system's failure to find the missing girl, despite numerous check-ins with her captor, led to a significant amount of criticism. In particular, his parole officer, Edward Santos Jr., was destroyed by the media. In November 22, he finally broke his silence on the case after 13 years. I searched the entire house and never found anybody else. I looked in the backyard and it was a typical backyard. A typical backyard that was it wasn't atrocious. It wasn't kept well. A lot of debris and a lot of appliances left on the lawn, overgrown shrubbery and grass. Nothing unusual about that, he said. It wasn't until the incident at UC Berkeley that Edward was even aware that he had 2 little girls with him, but he maintained that he played a crucial role in finding Jaycee. Edward said that after hearing about his suspicious visit, he went to their house and asked about the 2 little girls who had been seen. Philip told him their father had picked them up. You know, I tell people the planets, the moon, the stars were all in perfect alignment that day. There were multiple times I could have just documented this and let it go, but I didn't. I sat there and thought to myself, if I would have just let it go, if I would have just let it be. But I couldn't have done that. On that particular day with those 2 little girls, I was their guardian, he said. Edward instructed Philip to come to the parole office the next day with the girls' parents for further questioning. Instead, he showed up with his wife, the girls, and Jaycee Dugard, who they called Alyssa, and it wasn't long before he confessed. He nodded his head 3 times and says, a long, long time ago, I kidnapped her and raped her when she was a child. I spoke to Jaycee and I said, I wish I would have been there to discover you, being able to find you the first day I walked into that house, so I am sorry for that, but I did my job that particular day. Jaycee Dugard grew up in captivity, enduring 18 years of abuse and neglect at the hands of her captors. She managed to turn her life around and move on from her imprisonment. It was later deduced that she had developed Stockholm syndrome, but she later said that it was her only way of surviving.